Welcome to the first lesson in Unit 1 in Federal Government at TCC. We are going to talk about a few different chapters worth of material today, and those are reflected on your syllabus. And if you have any questions after listening to this lecture, please feel free to reach out to me. Before we get going on substantive material, I wanted to talk about a few different things that I think will be really important in helping you be the most successful you can be in this class. If you have not listened to the welcome lecture yet, please do that. That will give you a lot of information that will explain exactly how the syllabus is set up, exactly how the class will be set up. So it's very important for you to watch that. But here's a kind of an overview or a review of what we talked about there. I want everyone to succeed in this class. I want you all to get an A in the class. I want you to all feel like you've learned something in this class. So what you need to do to be successful is read the syllabus, the ICR, watch the introduction video because I go through the ICR step by step. I need you to listen to the lectures, so not just watch them without the sound. You actually need to listen to me speak, as crazy as it might be sometimes. You need to fill out the notes that are linked in this unit on your own. If you really want to get the most out of this class and really want to understand the concepts so you can do well on the exams and do well in the class, you really do need to fill those notes out on your own. Take the exams. It's strange that I have to say that, but every semester there are people who just do not take an exam or two or three. Don't miss any deadlines. There really aren't going to be a whole lot of deadlines in this class. There will be, last day of the units, when the units will cut off. At the end, there will be some hard deadlines as far as, completely unmovable deadlines because we have to get grades into the school and things like that. But don't wait till the last minute. Don't wait till after spring break to think about what you want to do in this class and, what you still have assignment-wise outstanding so that you can make, whatever grade you want to make. Start at the beginning, keep up, and you'll be fine. Now, extra credit will be available throughout the class. When it's a fall semester, I give you the option to register to vote if you're able to vote. And if you show me an I voted sticker, then you get extra credit. There's not really any elections right now in the spring semester, so extra credit will be more things like watching a lecture that is sponsored by the college, or watching a speech during the semester, things like that. If you have an idea for extra credit, bring it to me. There's a lot of different lectures and a lot of different things that happen that I can't remember every single one of them, and I can't know about every single one of them. So if you see something that's a great idea for extra credit, bring it to me. And watch your announcements on Blackboard because I will give you some options for extra credit there. And finally, be respectful of each other. Be respectful in everything you say and do, period. That's just always a good idea. But definitely be respectful in how you speak to each other on the discussion boards. You will find yourself with no credit on discussion boards if you leave snarky comments or if you are disrespectful to others. Okay, let's get started. Chapter 1 in your text discusses political culture. And political culture is a tricky, amorphous kind of term that people will throw around, what's the political culture in the United States? But the definition is sometimes difficult to understand. So political culture, like it says in your book, is the shared and deep-seated beliefs of the people about politics, and it's based on tradition. It explains the relationship between citizens and government. So basically it is your beliefs that you have from forever ago, from your family or from your growing up or from your background. And it's how you feel about politics. It explains your relationship between you and your government. So how do you feel about the government? How does your government treat you? How do other people in society feel about the government, and how does the government treat them? That is the political culture. There are a lot of things in political culture and things that we are going to talk about in this class that are pretty amorphous. So what is the country, or what is the United States? We have the physical boundaries of the United States, it starts at one sea and ends at the other kind of thing. And when you cross the boundary into Mexico or into Canada that you're no longer in the, quote, United States. But when we talk about what our country is, we're not talking about the physical or political boundaries. We're talking about what is the feeling, what are the people like in the United States? What makes the United States beyond just the boundaries of the land? It's really important what people think, because what people think is what determines what our political culture is. It's what determines what our, quote, country is. There are lots of different things that people think, and those things, sometimes go in one direction and sometimes go in another, as we see in the media on kind of a regular basis these days. But it really is important to look at what people think so that we can understand what the political culture is. Some people are misinformed and some people are uninformed, and those are two different things. An uninformed person is somebody who just has no idea who's the President of the United States, for example. They would be completely uninformed. They would have no idea when the election was. They would have no idea kind of what some issues are that are being discussed in our government. They wouldn't have any idea about what do people think about taxes? What does a certain politician think about whether or not there should be universal health care? Things like that. That's an uninformed person. But something different than that is misinformed. So misinformed is somebody who thinks that the only way Donald Trump was elected was because of Vladimir Putin, or that somebody was elected because of a glitch in a voting machine or something like that. Somebody who has some beliefs based on some kind of thinking or some kind of information that has been seen or been heard, and it is something that they that they believe but is not based in fact. So what's the cure for either of these, an uninformed person or a misinformed person? What is the cure for that? And is there a cure? Is there a way that we can fix this in our political culture? I am an eternal optimist and an idealist, and so of course I believe that there's a way to fix both the uninformed and the misinformed. Uninformed is easy. You run television ads, or you increase what is taught in schools, or the level of discourse that people have in their jobs and things like that. There's, public information campaigns, things like that. Correcting misinformation is a little more tricky just because the misinformation is based on something that sounds like it's really true. And often misinformed people can speak pretty loudly and try to espouse their beliefs quite loudly. And so it's got to be something besides just speaking louder than everyone else in the room to correct misinformation. I think that a good way to correct misinformation or the misinformed, and thankfully your book agrees with me, is critical thinking. If you engage in critical thinking, then it is difficult to remain misinformed. So what is critical thinking? Critical thinking is the process through which conclusions are reached, and it involves determining what can reasonably be believed and then using that information to reach a thoughtful conclusion. So that sounds pretty easy to understand, but also pretty imprecise as far as what is exactly the process by which people reach conclusions, and how do we determine what can be reasonably believed in order to reach that conclusion. So critical thinking takes somebody being open-minded. You have to listen to what other people are screaming loudly in order to determine whether or not it is something that you should reasonably believe in order to form your conclusions. It takes effort. It's super easy just to believe what you've thought all of your whole life. It takes effort to look at the other side and think, wait a second, are they making some good points? Is there something that that I would like to take from their platform and adopt into my own set of beliefs? It means that you have to avoid a confirmation bias, and a confirmation bias is basically just taking everything you hear and using it as evidence of what you already believe. So basically it means you need to set aside kind of your preconceived ideas and look at things with an open mind. So instead of listening to something and saying, oh, well, of course that's what they would say, because that just shows that they're lying. Or, of course, these people would believe that because, they're inherently wrong. Things like that. That is, never going to get you to truly think critically about something and to determine if you want to adopt a different belief or a kind of a different tweak to your same belief. It means moving out of your own echo chamber. And it's really nice in your own echo chamber. In your own echo chamber, only the people in your Twitter feed agree with you. Only the people you follow on social media are saying the same exact things that you believe. Nobody speaks with a different point of view to you. And being outside of your echo chamber is not very comfortable. It can make you be mad and get really frustrated listening to people say things that you think are just blatantly wrong, or just obviously, they're just obviously crazy for saying those things. But if you move outside your echo chamber, then you can see, wait a second, there are people who actually are intelligent people that I know to be intelligent people saying something completely different. Why are they saying that? What is it that makes them believe that? And once you start digging into it, then you can see, okay, well, what makes them believe that is some crazy person they're listening to, or what makes them believe that is this set of facts. What do I think about this set of facts? Things like that. It's not fun outside your echo chamber, but it is very important for critical thinking. And finally, you have to consider the source. Is the source somebody who actually has done some research and has some facts to base, to base their opinion, has some data to back up their conclusions? Or is it somebody who is just repeating something they heard a politician say, or they're just repeating something that they heard a pundit on TV say? So consider the source of your information and consider the source of, the person you're listening to's information. So with political culture, which, as we learned in the first slide, is just, the feeling about politics and the country and how I view my government, how my government views you, is based on a number of things. So what affects the political culture? Political culture is affected by your ancestry, so what your family's like. What is your family always said around the dinner table? What do your parents think? What do your grandparents think? How have you seen the government treat your family? It's also based on individualism, and we're going to talk about individualism later a little bit more, but individualism is just kind of your sense of self-sufficiency and your own individual beliefs. It's based on the Declaration of Independence. I mean, that was something that was pretty close to the beginning of this whole experiment that we call the United States. And the Declaration of Independence is, taught in schools. It's known by most people who live here, at least parts of it. And just the whole belief that we as a country can do something like write a document to the King of England and say, we're done here, that says something about our political culture. The preamble of the Constitution, we're going to go through some of the things that they say, but that it says in the preamble specifically. But the preamble, says that we want to, provide for the common defense. We want to ensure domestic tranquility. We want to establish justice. We want to do all of these things. And that's something that, runs at the base of our judicial system, of our political system, and it affects our political culture. There is something called the unalienable rights, and those are things that are just your own personal rights that are given to you as, by virtue of you being a human who lives in the United States. There are certain rights that we in the United States hold as so valuable that we're going to really watch anytime the government tries to infringe on those rights or take those rights away. And what is seen as an unalienable right kind of evolves over time, and it has changed. We're going to talk about, the right to vote and the right to, life, things like that. Those rights can sometimes be infringed upon by the government, but these are rights that we believe as Americans are rights that cannot be taken away. And finally, our political culture is impacted by the belief that the government of the United States is subordinate to the people. Sometimes you'll hear people say things like, well, politicians, you guys are public servants, you guys work for me. And it's true. That's the belief that the government is not greater than the people. The government is there to work for the people. So this is the Declaration of Independence, part of the Declaration of Independence, and these are some of the pieces of it that affected our political culture back then and affect it even today. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is something that was so important that we threw out right at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, meaning the government is subordinate to the people, the government is formed by the people, and no one gives the governing body their right but for the people. So the church doesn't determine who is going to be in power. The monarchy, or where somebody was born in history, does not determine who is in power. The people determine who is in power. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And that is, what I said earlier, the thought that government was so subordinate to people and people had these inherent rights. That is part of our political culture. Not everywhere in the world believes that. Not every government is set up like that. But the United States political culture is such that we believe that government is subordinate to people, and when government does something that shows that it is no longer acting subordinate to people, then the governed can say no thank you and get a new government. Now this is the preamble to the Constitution, very famous. You'll see it all over the place when you are in government buildings. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And that's a pretty meaty statement. We want a perfect union. We're striving to get there. And if we think that the union we're in is not perfect, then we're going to change it. We want to have domestic tranquility. We want to have justice. We want to provide for the common defense. So provide for defending all of our brothers and sisters who are also Americans. We want to promote general welfare. We want everybody to be okay and everybody to be taken care of, not just the elite class, not just the ones who were born into a certain caste. We want to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who come behind us. We want them to also have liberty and freedom. And so we establish the Constitution of the United States of America. If you have not read the Constitution of the United States of America, it is very short, and it is something that is a good read. It's not long at all. It's not like the Texas Constitution that is the longest, almost the longest, in the United States. It's something you could read in just, an hour or less. And I encourage you to do that. So let's talk about the foundation of the United States government. We just heard some things, the Declaration of Independence, the preamble to the Constitution, that laid out some of the things our government is built on. Liberty, which is the freedom to act and think as long as you don't hurt anybody else. So liberty is your freedom. Your individualism is your personal initiative and self-sufficiency. It's your right to be yourself and right to better yourself if you want to better yourself. You're not, just because you're born in a certain place or with a certain name or to a certain family, that doesn't mean that you can't decide that you're going to do something else in your life. Be a different person. Equality, meaning all people have equal worth and equal treatment and deserve equal treatment under the law. If you read the news, you may think like, wait a second, not all people are treated equally under the law. Not all people are being treated as if they have equal worth. And that's true. We're not perfect. But this is a foundation that we are striving for, is that all people have equal worth and deserve equal treatment under the law. And then finally, we built our government on the idea of self-government, that the people are the ultimate source of authority and have a voice. This is why we are allowed to vote so much. We are the ones who decide who is going to be in power, what kind of laws we are going to support, things like that. So self-government is not something that every single person in the United States, that every single person in the world has. It's something that people in the United States hold as uniquely sacred. So let's go back to equality, because equality is a tricky one. We, formed this government saying all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But at the same time, there were still people in slavery. How do we reconcile that all people have equal worth and equal treatment under the law when at the time that was written, there were people who were not being treated equally under the law? And even after slavery, when slavery was abolished, we had the time of legal segregation, saying, yes, okay, fine, you might not be slaves, but you sure as heck can't come to my school where I'm sending my children. You can't drink from the water fountain where other people of a different color are drinking, things like that. Is that equal worth and equal treatment under the law? And then you can just, read the story upon story of the ramifications if a white woman accused a black man during that time of, rape or improper treatment or misconduct or something like that. The treatment was much different under the law than it was if somebody had accused a white man of doing it, either a black woman, which would not even have been believed, or a white woman. And so where we are today, we've gotten past legal segregation, thank God, and we are now in a time where there is equality in theory and equality on the books, but our practice is still a little bit lagging. So there's still, you still say everybody can be given the same pay for a job, but then in practice, when you look at the pay discrepancies, you see that not all people get the same treatment. Not all people are entitled to the same treatment. So we are working on the practice still, but in theory, we do have all men are created equal. All people are created equal with equal worth and equal treatment. Individualism, we talked about a little bit earlier. Individualism is just the belief that with personal initiative, you can accomplish whatever you want to accomplish. Your own destiny is created by you. With hard work, you can be anything, that kind of thing. That if you're born, with in a certain social strata, you don't have to stay there. Everybody's available or able to, pull themselves up and make something great of themselves. just as people who were born into greatness are free to make something worthless of themselves. So that is, a foundation of our government is that as individuals, we are able to create our own future. So what does our political culture look like in practice? Well, the United States versus other countries, our political culture looks like we have more elections than anybody else. I don't know about you, but every time you turn around, don't you feel like you're heading to the polls for something? A special election, a primary election. We do have a primary system, which means that you don't have a list of just 100 people on the ballot and you hope that enough people vote for you. You have a system where you vet the different people who are running for office, the different candidates, and those people who are vetted by their parties through the primary system are allowed to be put up for a general vote. In the United States, unlike other places, we allow public demonstrations. We allow peaceful public demonstrations, and those demonstrations can be limited, they can be organized in a certain way, there can be certain procedural requirements, but those requirements cannot forbid public demonstrations. And if you're listening to this thinking, well, wait a second, there was a public demonstration at the Capitol in January, and those people were later arrested. Public demonstrations can't violate the law. Think of the public demonstrations you saw where people would march, like the Women's March, or women's marches all across the country, or the March for Our Lives, the marches that were protesting gun violence and calling for stricter gun laws. There were no arrests after that, not because of the content of what was being demonstrated, but because of the manner in which the demonstrations occurred. The demonstrations were held, with the consent of city, with the support of the city as far as offering, police to direct traffic and, the different, locations were allowing people to stand outside and stand on the lawn, stand in the public areas. What happened in January in the Capitol was a trespass because it was a going past the security checkpoints without going through security. It was, storming up the walls, storming through, breaking the windows, causing vandalism, affecting the offices where there were, break-ins and vandalism in the offices. Things were stolen. That's what people were arrested for, not because they had gathered peacefully in a park to listen to a speech or had even marched to the Capitol and were standing there screaming. That would have been a completely allowable public demonstration. And then finally, public education. Public education is something that we have in the United States that not everywhere has. We absolutely take it for granted that we are allowed to have public education and that the government, that society will provide that education for us and for our children. So when people talk about politics, when they say, "Ugh, I hate politics," or "Oh, I love politics, it's so wonderful to talk about," what are they talking about? Politics is the system by which a society settles its conflicts, allocates its benefits and its costs. So it's basically who gets what and how they get it and when they get it. And If we disagree, then we engage in a political discussion. We engage in a discussion about this topic of who gets what and how and when. Politics is where power is what those who are most able to affect the system have. So if somebody says that there is, well, that person has a lot of political power, say, the Speaker of the House has a lot of political power, it means that that person has a lot of influence and is able to affect the system of who gets what and how and when. Now, I have a degree in political science, and a lot of times people ask what political science is. And political science is kind of two different things. There's an art side and there's a science side. But either way, it is the study of government and politics. I went on the science side of that, and what that means is that I like to look at data a lot. I like to count things and analyze things on more of a mathematical way than a qualitative way, as why did somebody do a certain thing? Why did they feel like this was the best candidate? Things like that. So, but basically, political science is just the general study of government and politics, and again, politics being the system of who gets what and how and when. Let's take a tiny little detour and talk about an authoritarian government, just because a lot of times that word gets thrown around as to, a certain political party being, favoring an authoritarian government, or a certain person wanting an authoritarian government. An authoritarian government oppresses opposition, so does not allow others to speak out in, opposition to what that government believes. There's a lot of use of police and armed forces to stifle opposition. There are no free or fair elections. Sometimes you'll see countries that have a free election, but there's only one person on the ballot. That's not really a fair election. That's more of just a farce of an election system. They control the media and prohibit social media. So the media is not free to speak out in opposition to the government. They intimidate or prohibit opposition leaders from free expression. So they will intimidate people who especially are leaders of movements that oppose what they believe. So when you hear somebody throw out the word, well, so-and-so is in favor of an authoritarian government in the United States, think about what a real authoritarian government looks like. You can look to things like North Korea, look to things like China. There are a lot of places where there are authoritarian governments, and that is not something, that is the opposite of what we have in the United States, and not something that is going to be something that a single person can achieve quickly. So the United States, we have three different systems that we use. The first system is the constitutional system, and that is just our system of law that's based on the rule of law, including the protection of individual rights. It is using the Constitution as the supreme, law of the land, the foundation on which we build all the rest of our system of laws. It empowers individuals by allowing rights to be claimed in court. So it's set up a judicial branch of government, and it lets people petition that judicial branch of government and use that branch to allow them to keep their rights, to prohibit other people from infringing on their rights. And our constitutional system is where we get the separation of power with checks and balances. So we'll talk about this more when we talk about the three branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, and how the judicial branch is not all powerful. It has power that is subordinate to the executive branch, who has power subordinate to the legislative branch, who has power subordinate to the judicial branch, who has power, and it just goes on and on. And so there are certain aspects where each branch is, in control, but there are certain aspects that are checked, are watched by the other branches of government. Our system of government is a democracy, which means that we have a majority rule through elections. We have a system of elections, and who we elect is the one who's in charge. We can talk about the Electoral College when we talk about elections a little bit more, because sometimes you'll see throughout history that maybe the majority of voters are not the ones who actually choose who the president is. But with that caveat, and we'll explain that a little bit later in a little more detail, generally we have a majority rule through elections. And a democratic system empowers the majority group and their officials. So if, we basically, our democracy means that if you are the losing party, you accept your loss and you agree that the person who got the majority vote is the one who's in charge and is the one who is able to be in power until the next election. And then finally, sometimes you'll hear our society and our government talking about free market. We have a free market society. And our free market society is just an economic system that's based on transactions between private parties. It doesn't mean anything more than we're all allowed to participate in the economic system. It empowers business, it empowers the wealthy, it empowers those who are better at transactions between private parties. They're better negotiators, they're better visionaries at determining what is the best way to achieve these transactions. What is the best product to offer? What is the best way to offer that product? Things like that. I want to just debunk a couple of different things that you may hear. Communism, we do not live in a communist country. We do not have a communist system because the government does not own all of the industry. A communist system is where the government owns everything, private parties don't own anything, and the government tells the different entities, how much bread they'll bake, how many guns they'll make, things like that. A place where the government owns all of the industry is North Korea. That is a communist system. A socialist system is where the government owns key industries to guarantee that everybody has equal opportunities or has equal provision from that industry. So, for example, in Sweden, where government owns certain key industries so that it can guarantee the same standard of living to all of its people. Now, that means that the wealthy are less wealthy, but it also means the poor are less poor. So I'm not saying one system socialism is a better system necessarily than the free market system, but it's just there's a different outcome after if you have a socialist system versus a free market system. Okay, so that is the end of our discussion of Chapter 1, but I am going to go through a few more chapters in this lecture, so because they all just really kind of tie into the same basic idea or the same basic concept. So let's talk about public opinion. What is public opinion? It's the politically relevant belief held by an ordinary citizen that they express openly. So, taking that apart, if I don't express my belief, then it's not part of the public opinion. It's just my belief. And if it's not politically relevant, then it's not really part of the public opinion as we think about in a government context. So if I say yellow is the best color and I express it openly, well, that's my belief, and I'm an ordinary citizen, but it's not really politically relevant. Same thing if I say there should be universal health care for all, but I don't tell anybody that, then that's not really part of the public opinion, because I'm not contributing to the public opinion because I'm not saying anything. I'm not putting that opinion out in the public. So how do you express your beliefs? If you are somebody who is an ordinary citizen, meaning not an elected official or the President of the United States, something like that, how do you express your beliefs, your politically relevant beliefs? You can respond to a survey. If you are one of those people who answers your phone from a number you don't know, or responds to emails from people that you don't know, you could respond to a survey. You could tell your neighbors. That's expressing something openly. If I go to my next door neighbor and chat with him about what my politically relevant belief is, I can demonstrate. I can go out and hold up a sign and march down my sidewalk, or I can stand at a street corner, or I can be a part of an organized march. And I can also vote. That is openly expressing my politically relevant belief that I hold as an ordinary citizen. And I do that by checking a box or clicking a button or coloring in a circle or something like that when I'm voting. The thing is, public opinion doesn't dictate policy. So me expressing my public opinion about whether or not there should be universal health care does not make universal health care manifest itself in my city. It doesn't actually affect anything directly, as in except affecting the actions of my elected officials. But me just saying something politically relevant openly doesn't dictate something that will happen. An example you might think about is, for example, the school shooting marches. There were people who were marching for greater gun control, stricter gun laws, telling people on social media until they are just blue in the face about how, look at Sandy Hook, look at all these different schools where children were shot. We have to have better gun laws. They would write their senators. They would, wear t-shirts. They would hold rallies. They were openly expressing their politically relevant beliefs. But do we have stricter gun laws? We do not. So that's an example of public opinion not dictating policy. But let's talk about public opinion's influence. The smaller number of voters, the more an official will listen. So if you live in a place where, you live in a small town and you're electing your mayor and you're one of 50 people who are voting or able to vote, then your official is going to listen to you more intently than maybe if you are, trying to petition the mayor of Fort Worth or the mayor of Dallas, where you're one of thousands and thousands of voters in the area. So our example is, my opinion has a greater influence on Congress. Specifically, my opinion has a greater influence on my elected representative for the House of Representatives than it does on my senator, which is just one of 2 people in Texas, and than it does on the president, which is I'm one of millions and millions and millions of people who are able to vote. So the smaller the pool is that is electing your official, the greater your power is in influencing that official and influencing their actions with your public opinion. Also, the more intense the response, the more the official will listen. So if I write a letter, that's going to be something that they maybe read. But if I call them every day, then that's something they're probably going to take a little bit more seriously. If I go sit on their, office steps peacefully and legally and hold a sign, that's something they're going to even take more seriously. If I stand outside their office with a bullhorn, that's a pretty intense response, and that's more likely going to get them to listen than just if I tweet them or if I write them a letter. Also, the more salient the issue, the more the official will listen. So if I am petitioning my congressperson for, more protection for the gray heron that lives in the pond in my neighborhood park, that's not going to get as much attention as if I petition my congressperson for stricter gun laws in our area to prevent school shootings. So the more important the issue, or the more kind of relevant to the public the issue is, the more the official is likely going to listen. But what if an uninformed person is the one with a super loud voice, or the bullhorn guy? Why, if that person is uninformed, or even more dangerously, what if that person is misinformed and standing out inside the official's office with a bullhorn every single day? Should that person have a greater influence on the public official than somebody who is a, mild-mannered but perfectly informed voter? It shouldn't matter. It should, you would hope that it wouldn't matter more. But the truth is, just if you look at this from a psychological and a socioscience background, it is going to have a greater influence. The louder the voice, the more the attention that's going to get paid to it, whether or not that voice is uninformed or misinformed. It also depends on whether the official governs as a delegate or a trustee. So a delegate versus a trustee is something that we talk about a lot in Texas government, but it's just two different ideas about how a person should act when they've been elected to public office. One's not right and one's not wrong. A delegate is somebody who says, I have been chosen by the voters, by my constituents, and so I'm going to do whatever they want me to do, whether I think it's the best thing or not. And a trustee is someone who says, I was chosen by these people, but I know what's best for them. So I'm going to go exercise my own judgment and, act however I believe is in their best interest. So, as you can see, public opinion will affect the delegate tremendously because they will heed every public opinion, thinking, these people elected me, so I better do exactly as they say. And it's not going to have much effect on a trustee who says, I know what's best for everybody. You can tell me every day what you think about is best for the rest of the constituents, or what's best for the country or the state. But I'm going to do whatever I want because I know best what is, in my best judgment, what's going to be the best for the rest of, the constituents. So if you Google public opinion, you're not going to be able to see a picture of it. You may see a picture of somebody expressing their public opinion, but you don't see an actual picture of public opinion. It's intangible, And so how are we going to measure what the public opinion is? Well, we do lots of things. If you're a political scientist, like I was when I was in college or studying political science, from the science perspective, this is where you get really excited. You look at election results. You look at demonstrations and you see how many people are demonstrating. How big is the crowd versus how big is the counter-protesting crowd, or how big is the crowd on the other side of the street. You look at how many people are petitioning their elected official, or how many people are writing letters to the editor, comments in articles, things like that, in order to see, you know, is this something that everybody's talking about, or is this something that one person is talking about in a lot of different ways? But even if you measure public opinion, you can't say why people are having that opinion or why people are acting out on that public opinion. There's some ways you can try to figure that out. Some ways you can try to figure that out are using opinion polls. And what opinion polls are is you just take a sample of people and you try to extrapolate, okay, if I talk to 1% of the population and then I multiply that by 100, then that's probably what the population as a whole thinks. So if I take my sample size and then I, you know, use math and I extrapolate those numbers, then I should be able to tell what everybody likes. But the problem is you have to have non-volunteers. So you can't just say, you know, advertise on a Biden for President website, hey guys, take this political poll and let me know what you think, because those volunteers that you've advertised on that website are all going to basically say the same thing. You have to choose people at random. You can't just say, okay, I'm going to go to this wealthy neighborhood and I'm going to knock on every door and ask these people, non-volunteers, what their opinion is, because that's not really a random sample. That's a sample of all of the people who probably look similar and make about the same amount of money and choose to live in the same neighborhood and go to the same schools and things like that. Not a random selection. You have to have an adequate sample size. So that means that if you only talk to 20 people in Fort Worth, and then you say, well, everybody who lives in Fort Worth believes this because I talked to 20 people and 19 of them agreed with me. So obviously most people, the overwhelming majority in Fort Worth, believe. That's not a very good sample size. But if I speak to, you know, in a class of 30 students, if I speak to 10 students, that's a third of the size of the class, and I can probably get a good understanding of whether or not somebody understood something I said or somebody thought something was a good idea. And if I, you know, increase that to 20 students, so that being 2/3, well, that's an incredible sample size. So you have to look at using math and probability, look at the sampling error, and sometimes you'll see, you know, 95% of the people believe this, plus or minus 7%. Well, so that means that it could be everybody believes it, or it could be less than 90% of the people believe it. So always look at the sampling error when you're kind of trying to decide if an opinion poll is an adequate representation of what is, you know, the belief that is held by the people. So polls can measure direction. So does somebody agree with something or disagree with something? Intensity. So do you strongly disagree? Do you even know what's happening? How likely you are to act? Things like that. And salience. So what is the most important issue? Is this something that people care about? Do people care about that the best color is yellow? Or do they care more about gun control in the schools to prevent school shootings. I think we already have gun control in the schools, but gun control in order to reduce school shootings. So how do opinion polls work? Like the nuts and bolts of it. Usually computers randomly choose phone numbers, and by saying, here are all the phone numbers, we're going to choose 10,000 of them and call those people. That's a pretty great way to do it, because there you're not limiting to a certain geographic location, you're not limiting to a certain age or income level or anything like that. However, what if a person doesn't have a phone? Does their opinion not mean anything, because their opinion is not going to get considered, since they would not have a phone to have their number randomly chosen? What if somebody doesn't want to participate? And what if a lot of people don't participate? Well, then that skews the study, because the only people that are participating are probably the people with strong opinions one way or the other. So you may just get the outliers who are responding to the poll. How do you know the person that's responding has any idea of what the issue is and knows how to answer questions about that? How do you know if the person's telling the truth and not just being a contrarian or trying to mess up your poll or trying to create some sort of alternate perception of themselves? And how do you word the question? There's a whole class basically on this if you're going to study political science at a high level. And there's a lot of debate about whether a question is worded properly, is worded fairly, is worded to suggest a correct response or to elicit a completely unbiased response. Okay, switching gears a tiny bit, let's talk about political socialization. Political socialization is looking at where our opinions come from. Why do certain people have certain beliefs and other people have other beliefs? You're not born with an R or a D tattooed on you, and you're not born having a certain set of political beliefs, but you learn it from your family and from those who are around you when you're a child. The primary places that we learn our political beliefs are from our family, our school, and our church. So many people, if you look, have the same beliefs as their family. Now, as they grow older and as they separate from their family, their beliefs may diverge, but especially when you are younger, you probably had the same beliefs as most of the people in your family. Your school affects your political socialization by requiring that you say the Pledge of Allegiance in school when you're in public school. That is something that is every day you're reciting that you pledge your allegiance to the United States of America. That we are one nation under God. We are indivisible. We have liberty, and we believe in justice for all people. That's something you say every single day. It's part of something that's going to be ingrained in your brain. Teachers have a lot to do with political socialization, especially teachers in younger levels of school, where they talk about, the great parts of our country. They talk about the greatness of different leaders in our country, and their beliefs can really shape what you think about the president or Congress or different aspects of our country. And then finally, if you attend a church that espouses beliefs about political people, either specifically or political issues more more amorphously, then you're probably going to believe it too. Now, the secondary agents of political socialization are your peers, the media, leaders, and events that happen. So your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, people that you spend time with, people that are around you for, years or months or days. If others have one opinion and you hold a different opinion, you're going to hear their opinion, you're going to hear them talk about their opinion, but you might not speak up about saying, I disagree. You may just listen, and you're in a forced listening position where you have to listen to why they believe what they believe. What the media says is what people think is happening. The media tells us that crime is increasing. Is it really? Or is it just that we hear about all the crime, and so we think that there's more crime than there actually is if you look at the whole, public? Does everybody really oppose legal marijuana, or is that something that the media is reporting to us, and so we perceive it to be, everybody believes that this issue or this, legal marijuana is wrong. The president is somebody that people look for answers, look to for answers. So especially, think about post 9/11. The country was looking to the president to tell us who is the person responsible for this, who should we be mad at, who should we hate, and who should we fight against, who should we be scared of, things like that. The president can really shape political socialization that way. Events can shape how you look at government and how you believe in politics, and also how our leaders act. So if you see Congress is always in gridlock, there's nobody ever going to say that an opposing, person or opposing belief is correct, then you think, well, fine, we should just all not get along. I'm not going to believe anything that somebody in a different party says. But think about the concession speech that John McCain gave when he lost to Barack Obama. And when you look at that speech, you can see how he acted. Did he say, look, we wish him luck. He's got a lot of stuff going on right now. He's got a lot of things that are going to be challenging, and he's a good guy. We should all get behind him. That's going to increase people taking Barack Obama, as somebody who they can, even if they don't agree with, get behind, versus, if somebody refuses to give a concession speech. And what does that make you think about the level of respect that you should give to not only the person who is refusing to give the concession speech, but also the person who was elected? So that can all affect our political socialization. So sometimes you'll hear about your frame of reference. Well, what's my frame of reference? What's my thought about this? And your frame of reference is how you think politically, and what gives you a basis for a common cause. So how does my frame of reference affect what I think about something, and basically how is my frame of reference going to be created? How is my lens through which I view the news and what people say on TV and what people say on Twitter, how, it's going to affect how I view those things. So how is your frame of reference created? Through party identification, which is just your it's not your legal membership, whether I'm a legal card-carrying member of one party or of another, but it's just kind of my identification, my feeling of alignment with that party. As you get older, your ability to believe, think of yourself as a Democrat at one minute and a Republican maybe in the next election, or your identification with both parties or neither party decreases, and you become more able to identify with one party or the other. Your ideology, which is just your general belief about the role of government and the purpose of government. And so we'll talk about ideology. Ideology is things like, do I feel more conservatively that the government should take less action? Or do I feel more liberally that the government needs to have its hand in all different aspects so that we can eliminate income inequality, things like that. Your religious group affects your frame of reference. So are you Jewish? Are you atheist? Do you have a religious group? Are you Catholic, Protestant? Kind of what? In Texas, are you a Southern Baptist? Are you a Methodist? Are you Episcopalian? All of these things can really help shape your frame of reference. Your economic class, your income and your education affects what you think about taxes and labor unions. This is not really as much as it is in other countries, especially in Europe, where you are stuck in a class and you're not going to be able to kind of crawl your way out of that class without much, without kind of something wonderful happening or something terrible happening. But here in the United States, our income and our education affects what we think about how many taxes should be paid, or who should be paying taxes, or whether or not labor unions should have any power, or more power, or less power, or what we think about those things. The region, so kind of where you live in the United States, can affect your frame of reference. And this is decreasing as something that can really affect your frame of reference, because people move so much now. It used to be that, everybody was born and raised in your same little town, but now people move all over the place. And so, but as you can see, if you even just looked at a map of the 2020 election, you can see certain areas of the country are decidedly red. Certain areas are decidedly blue. And so those are, it's not a map that looks speckled where every state is just a little bit different, but it's your region and what your, most people in your region think or how they vote. Your race and your ethnicity really can shape your frame of reference, especially on social issues like civil rights or affirmative action or, police, whether police should be defunded, or the issue of police brutality. Your gender may affect your views, especially when it comes to things that really affect you because of your gender. So if you're a female, you may have some really specific views about childcare and whether or not, childcare should be provided universally, and whether or not childcare should be something that is, made really easy to obtain. Income inequality. Some people of some genders have always benefited from income inequality, and so that's not something that they necessarily probably think about. It's not part of their frame of reference. Income, education, social welfare, all of these things may affect, all of these things may affect your frame of reference. And then finally, your generation. If you, grew up at a time when there was a world war going on, that's going to affect your view of politics and affect your view of the way the country should act and react, versus if you were, raised in a time when you never saw a war. And therefore, you don't think about the size of our armies or the amount of money spent on defense because it's not something you've ever had to worry about. And your thoughts may turn to more of, social issues, things like that. So we're going to talk about ideology and party. This is one of those things that kind of, once you learn it, it becomes something that kind of irritates you when you hear people misuse these words. So ideology is how you believe about something. So whether you're a conservative or a liberal. So you can be an economic conservative, meaning you think that the government should have a little role in the economy. Or you can be economically liberal, meaning the government should really check big business and make sure that the taxes are equally applied and taxed more if you're a big business. You can be socially conservative, meaning you're not a fan necessarily of same-sex marriage, or you don't think that marijuana should be legal. Or you could be socially liberal, thinking same-sex marriage should be fine, transgender people deserve, to use whatever restroom they want, or marijuana is not a gateway drug and it should be legal, and things like that. So that is, your ideology is some way you believe. Your party, however, is different. So you can be a Democrat but still consider yourself conservative, or you can be a Republican and still consider yourself liberal. Your party is not the same as your ideology. So it's not, are you a conservative or a Democrat? Or are you liberal or a Republican? That's like saying apples and oranges. Are you a Honeycrisp and Clementine? Or a Clementine? Like those are two separate things. So you can see kind of how the political parties on this chart line up. Usually somebody who is economically and socially conservative identifies more with the Republican Party, whereas people who are economically and socially liberal will identify with the Democratic Party. Now, people who are economically liberal, so think that the government should have less of a role in the economy, but socially conservative are populists, and people who are socially liberal, so think things like same-sex marriage are okay, but economically conservative, but keep your hands off my money and quit taxing me so much, well, that is a libertarian. And so those are people that's just kind of where people with certain beliefs usually matriculate, kind of where they find home, and other people that they share beliefs with in those certain parties. But remember, when I'm talking about party, I'm talking about political parties like the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. But ideology is just your idea about whether you're conservative or liberal. So let's continue talking about frame of reference. So in the United States, there is more cross-cutting than in other countries. So there is more of a kind of change in your frame of reference, or change in the way you look at something based on your frame of reference. So when you hear something, you may, because of your frame of reference, you think of it some way, whereas somebody else who has a different frame of reference doesn't even hear it the same way or doesn't see any issue with it. So let's take, for example, if somebody calls a woman hun, well, some people that won't even like register with them, because their frame of reference doesn't see that as anything but well, guys are just going to be guys. Boys will be boys and call people honey or sweetie or something like that. They don't mean anything by it. It's just something they do. Some people will hear it and it'll be very triggering for them. They'll see it as misogyny. Well, obviously you don't respect women enough to learn their names or speak to them correctly. And really, your frame of reference is going to affect a lot of what you see on the news. So, for example, Obama was one of those presidents who would honor all different kinds of holidays, and when he honored a holiday that is observed by Muslims, it was because some people who had a certain frame of reference said, well, yeah, of course he honors that holiday because he was a Muslim. However, other people, it didn't even register as something that was triggering. But they said, well, obviously he honors holidays because he honors all holidays and he's an inclusive person. And so really your frame of reference is going to affect how you look at basically everything you see and everything you hear. And it can really affect, your perception of reality, and you may choose to perceive something a certain way based on your frame of reference. So that is the end of chapter 6. We're going to move on to chapter 7, and it is going to be the last chapter that we cover in this lecture. So chapter 7 talks about political participation, and political participation is just your involvement in activities that are intended to influence public policy and leadership. So how much do you participate in something that has political undertones and is intended to influence those who are elected? Why is political participation important, and is it important? Everybody should have the ability to get involved in the political system, and there should be very few barriers to political participation. I think that, when you are involved in the political system, it gives you more of a feeling of being a part of the government that is being helped to be elected. You can take you feel like you have more of a leadership role in our society. So what are some examples of political participation? So you can always vote, you can run for office, but there's got to be something else you can do to participate in the political system than just vote once every 2 or 4 years and run for office, which not everybody wants to do. You can write letters, can sign a petition, can talk to your friends or your coworkers about political issues, can call your congresspeople, can help distribute campaign literature, pass out flyers, or address postcards. You can contribute money to a campaign, you can put a bumper sticker on your car, post on social media that you're voting for a certain person or how great a certain political candidate is or how important a certain issue is. You could join an interest group like a trade association, a union, something like that. You could serve on a political party committee. You could act as a delegate to a convention. So when they're asking people who will go to the state convention and vote a certain way, you could volunteer to do that. And you could also participate in a demonstration, a march, or a sit-in. And so think about some different ways you could participate in government and different ways you may have participated in the political system. And I may ask you at some point for your number. What's your number about political participation? And what that means is I want you to look at all of these and count the number of things that you've done. Have you written letters and signed a petition but not done anything else? Well, then your number would be 2. Have you done all of these things? Well, then your number would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Your number would be 12. And so if I ask you, what is your number? that is what I'm talking about, your political participation number. I will tell you my political participation number is 12. I've done actually all of these things. And so I've done them for different candidates, for different, sometimes Democrats, sometimes Republicans, sometimes conservatives, sometimes liberals, but my number would be 12. How does political participation influence the government? We know that demonstrations, things like that, don't lead to direct policy change, but how are we influencing the government by participating? Well, our individualism, meaning our belief that individuals are able to chart their own path and create their own destiny, our individualism causes us to want to solve our own problems and not rely on a process. So we don't really participate very much. We don't think that the government that we elect necessarily is going to affect how much money we make or what kind of a job we can get. Now, if you are less affluent, meaning you don't have as much money, and you have less education, or you have less education, those two things don't necessarily mean one affects the other, but if you have less education, then you think that politicians aren't going to listen to you as much because they also know that you're probably not going to vote. And that's probably true. You're probably not going to vote. The studies show, the data shows that the less money you make and also the less education you have, the less likely you are to vote. But you also have to consider if you have the least amount of power in the marketplace, like you have the least amount of effect over an industry or effect over a group of people, then you're probably going to have the least amount of political power. And you're probably going to have the least amount of political participation. Voter participation, the Constitution of the United States gave the states the power to determine the time, place, and manner of elections. So the states are the ones who are able to say, polls are open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and we're going to have 10 polling sites and we're going to do it by electronic voting. And then another state may say we're only open from 6 a.m. to noon, and we're only at the convention center, and you have to, bring a pencil because you got to fill in bubbles, things like that. So the Constitution says that the states can say the time, place, and manner of the election. States in the past have chosen to limit suffrage or the right to vote to property-owning males. So in response, the Constitution had to be amended. The 15th Amendment said a state cannot restrict the right to vote based on race, color, or condition of servitude, meaning whether or not you're a slave. So did that fix voting in the United States? And after the 15th Amendment, everyone could vote? No, absolutely not. States enacted poll taxes or literacy tests, things like that. And the courts had to step in and say the 15th Amendment did not anticipate that you would enact such laws, and such laws are in conflict of the Constitution, and therefore invalid. It did not allow all males the right to vote. The 19th Amendment came in because you see the 15th Amendment did not mention your gender. It said race, color, or condition of servitude, meaning all men were able to vote. The 19th Amendment said, oh yeah, and women too. Women can have the right to vote. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. Before that it was 21. The problem was, at the time that the voting age was 21, The government was also drafting people who were 18 years of age to go fight in Vietnam. So the argument was, wait a second, you can tell me I have to go fight for a war that is being, that has been decided upon by people that I'm not even old enough to elect. And can't really argue with that logic, so the voting age was lowered to 18. So let's talk a little bit about voter turnout. Voter turnout is when you talk about what was voter turnout in a specific election, it's the proportion of adults who actually vote. So the people who are 18 years of age or older who actually get out of their house and go stand in line at the polls and cast a vote. It's usually about 60% in presidential elections and 40% in midterm elections, which are just the elections that are held in the even-numbered years when there's not a presidential election. It's usually very low in local elections. In 2018, there was a surge in voter turnout, which is 2018 was a midterm year, but still the voter turnout did not reach 50% in a midterm year. In other democracies, most people vote. 70 to 85% of people vote. Everybody will vote in another democracy. So why do we in the United States not vote? There's lots and lots of reasons. One reason is voter registration is a pain, and you usually have to make sure that your registration is current. You don't have to re-register every time, but you do have to actually make sure you've registered, and if you've moved, to change your address. We have a lot of elections in the United States, and sometimes people get election fatigue. You feel like, God, I just voted. I just stood in line for this. Why am I having to do it again? And because we have so many elections, it's something that we oftentimes will just, skip an election or three. Our education and our income affect whether or not we're going to get out to vote. So, like we talked about earlier, if you have a low education and a low income, then you're not going to be very interested to vote. And in our country, there are lots of people who have a low education or a low income. Your age determines whether or not you're going to vote. So generally, the younger you are, the less likely you are to vote. And the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. So it wasn't really novel to see pictures of people who were 100 years old, being wheeled up in their wheelchairs to vote. It's actually more novel when you see an 18-year-old standing out, in a line waiting to vote. Your civic attitude is going to affect whether or not you vote. So basically, if you care about the government, if you feel like you have an interest in this, or you feel like you have a say in this, then you're probably going to vote. And also your interest in partisanship. If you are very interested in an issue that's being voted on, or an issue that is hot at the moment that is being discussed by a lot of candidates, you're probably going to vote. If you identify with a political party, studies show that you are more likely to vote. Now, if you don't identify with any political party, a lot of times you'll just say, like, well, it's going to be a Democrat or a Republican, and I don't really care between, one way or the other. So you're probably not going to get out there and vote. Okay, so we're going to go through those, each of those 6 things a little bit more specifically, but let's talk about registration. Voter registration. It started as a way to fight voter fraud and ensure that it was just one person, one vote, so that one person wasn't voting over and over and over again because there wasn't really any registration that would kind of keep up with whether or not somebody voted more than once. Other countries have registration, but they put the burden on the government to ensure that people are registered. So basically, you're assumed registered unless you opt out or unless you are unable to be registered to vote. Some places in the United States have day of registration, and some places in other countries do too, and that studies show that really increases the turnout because you don't have to plan ahead. You don't have to, in Texas, you have to have registered a month before, and so you don't have to plan ahead in order to vote. There is something called the Motor Voter Act that was enacted in 1993, and that really increased voter turnout because it increased the amount of people who are able to register, since you were able to register to vote when you got your driver's license. It was as easy as, being an organ donor. You can just do it all at the same time. Instead of having to really think about, okay, wait, there's an election in a month, I need to make sure and go out and find a voter registration card and register to vote. If there is a 2-week registration period, and that means that there's only a certain window of time when people can register, and if you also don't let people vote in absentee ballots, so basically when there's when they're not able to register or beforehand, then there's much lower turnout. So the more difficult the registration laws are, the more difficult it is to vote, and the lower voter turnout there will be. Some people don't have a government ID or a driver's license. Some people don't have a passport or some form of identification. And so if those things are required for registration, then certain people who don't have those will not be able to vote. And so that will alienate and disenfranchise, which just means prevent some people from voting. So the second thing we talked about was the frequency of elections. Okay, so frequency of elections. Like I mentioned before, we get election fatigue in the United States. We vote 2 to 3 times more we have 2 to 3 times more elections than people in Europe. So we have 2 to 3 times more opportunities to go out and vote. Or, as you can maybe see it, as requirements, 2 or 3 times more than anywhere else. We have an election every 2 years, plus we have primaries, and plus we have local elections. I mean, every time you turn around, you can feel like you're voting, and especially if it's kind of a pain to vote. Maybe you have to stand in line, maybe you have to go to a certain place during certain hours, you have to remember when the voting periods are, then those are just things that you're going to see as hurdles. And so in the United States, that's why our voter turnout is lower than other places. So let's talk about income and education. There is a positive relationship between the amount of income you have and the amount of education you have and the likeliness you are to vote. So what that means is if you have a higher education, you're more likely to vote. Lower education, less likely to vote. Same with your income. In Europe, lower income individuals have strong unions, and since they have a stronger party to represent the group's interests, that increases their likeliness to vote because they feel like, they feel like they're part of a strong group that has a loud voice. Less education can mean less knowledge of how or why to vote. So you may not know that you have to register beforehand. You may not know where you're supposed to go to vote or how often elections happen. So if you're less educated, you are less likely to vote. And if you have less money, The practical part of it is you might not have permanent housing, you might not have access to transportation, so you might not actually get the opportunity to get out to vote. Also, if you live in a place where voting booths are only open for certain periods of time, you may have to work during those times, and your job may be one that requires, more off hours instead of the higher paying, 8 to 5 kind of job, professional job hours. And so that can all hinder your right to vote. Okay, let's talk about age. There's also a positive relationship between your age and your likeliness to vote. What that means is the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. The younger you are, the less likely you are to vote. So why is it that younger people are less likely to vote? Time, for one thing. Again, younger people might have jobs that work strange hours instead of the professional 9 to 5 hours. They also have a lot of things that infringe upon their time. They may have a job, they may be going to school, they may have young children, they may have, lots of responsibilities with their family, things like that. Those things can make it so that you can't add one more thing to your day on election day. Your interest in the different issues or even knowledge of the different issues may be limited if you're young. Again, for the same reason that you don't have a lot of time, you may not spend the time you do have researching what issues are important political issues of the day. And you may actually not care. You may not care much about, Medicare for all, because it's going to be a long time before you need to think about Medicare. And younger people are more transient, and this doesn't mean homeless. This just means they're likely to move a lot, and they, especially if they're living in college away from home and they go home sometimes, or they maybe move in with friends, or maybe they move to a different place for a job or an internship. That's, just adding one more thing to the move is now you have to figure out what the election procedures are in that new place where you live. And sometimes that's just not something that's going to get a lot of their time. But studies show that the younger you are, the less likely you are to vote. The older you are, the more likely you are to vote. Fifth is your civic attitudes. Again, positive relationship between your civic attitudes and your likeliness to vote. So if you really think that, it's your civic duty to vote, you really care about different, issues and how your government is run and how your city is run, things like that, you're more likely to vote. Some people have apathy, which is just a lack of interest. If you have a lack of interest in the government, then you probably have a lack of interest in figuring out how to vote. Some people are just alienated, so they feel like they don't have a voice in government, and since they don't have a voice that anybody's listening to, then why would they spend time and effort in trying to vote? When people talk about your civic duty, well, it's your civic duty to vote. Well, it just means that there's a belief that some people hold that you should participate in elections, you should participate in voting, you should participate in politics, just because you're an American, you're a citizen of the city and or the country, and you should participate in voting and participate in the government. And if you have that kind of a thought that you it's your civic duty to vote, more likely you are to vote. Okay, last one, your interest and partisanship. Once again, there is a positive relationship. The more interested you are in politics, the more interested you are in the government, the more likely you are to vote. Or if you're strongly affiliated with a party, the more likely you are to vote. Why is this? Because if you are more interested in what's happening in the government, or you are strongly affiliated with a party, then you are more familiar with the differences between different candidates and different issues. There was somebody who wrote an article about basically, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are the same, and it doesn't matter which one's elected because they both basically are the same. And that's kind of the perspective that somebody would generally take if they are not partisan. They would look at candidates and say, like, I can't really tell the difference, and so I don't really care who's the president. And so it does affect your willingness to get out and vote. So we talked about these 12 different ways you can participate in government. There are conventional and there are unconventional ways you can participate in government. So the conventional ways that you can participate in the political system is by campaigning or lobbying, either giving money to a lobby or contacting officials, actually attending, planned rallies by different political parties. You can virtually support a candidate on social media, or you can raise money for that candidate, even if you're doing it by raising it online. You can be involved in your community in order to participate in the political system. Even grassroots online movements are more considered conventional ways to participate in politics. Some unconventional ways are things that are kind of outside of institutionally supported activities. So we're thinking of marches and rallies that are not planned by a political candidate or a political party or a lobby or something like that, but they're more of almost like pop-ups, more impromptu marches and rallies. Historically, there was the civil rights movement, so bus boycotts, marches, sit-ins, things like that. Those were unconventional ways to try to participate in the political system. Recently, we've seen some pretty glaring examples of some ways that different groups have tried to unconventionally participate in the political system. And we'll just talk about a few recent movements. There was the Tea Party movement, which was, kicked off April 15th, 2009. They threw tea bags over the White House fence to target the government and say, we're opposing higher taxes. So a little different than dumping tea into the Boston Harbor, but with the same intent. There was Occupy Wall Street, which was in 2011, and this was right after the big banks and the financial industry received a big bailout from the government. And so the people all over the country had rallies and kind of sit-ins, and I would say sit-ins, but it was kind of move-ins to parks, especially on Wall Street, to try to show Wall Street that and the private wealth, that this was not okay. Black Lives Matter was really started ramping up in recent years, but it started when there started to be an increase in the killing of unarmed black men by police. And so I won't say it started when that first started, because that has probably been going on for the entire time that we've had police, and so, or we've had a system of law enforcement in the United States. But it's really been something that's on everybody's minds in the past couple of years. And the target there are local officials trying to make people hold policemen accountable when there is a killing of an unarmed person of a certain race. The Me Too movement was a little more recent, 2017, and that was targeting people who sexually assault others. And it's not just women, it's was aimed at any kind of sexual misconduct, harassment, assault. It wanted to increase victim awareness. I mean, there have been some men who have spoken out in support of the Me Too movement, and as far as sharing their own stories, saying that they also have been victims. And so that is a way that, by using #MeToo was a way that people unconventionally connected and tried to participate in the political, campaign against those who were accused of or suspected of sexual harassment or assault. There was March for Our Lives in 2018, which was targeting the government and trying to participate in the political system by showing elected officials that there should be, there was support for stricter gun laws in order to prevent further school shootings. So I didn't add on the recent movement of storming the Capitol because I don't really know what that's called, but that was obviously directed at the government and those who were voting to finalize the vote, the presidential vote in 2021 or 2020, but voting in 2021 and trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of power from Donald Trump to Joe Biden because of the belief that the election was invalid. So what does it take for one of these movements to succeed? Well, it takes resources. It takes somebody with money getting behind this. It takes a lengthy period of action. So there can't just be one day everybody posts #MeToo and then everybody forgets about it. There has to be something, somebody talking about this and somebody acting on this for a significant amount of time. And there has to, have some sort of a goal. It can't just be we hate the government. Generally, it has to be we think that taxes are too high, or we think that there should be stricter gun laws. So there has to be some sort of a goal that is of the movement. So what happens with movements? How does the public react to movements? Not well is the answer. The public does not embrace movements and unconventional ways of politically participating as much as they do voting. As you saw with the storming of the Capitol in 2021, the elected officials from both sides of the aisle were, condemning that action. Elected officials aren't going to necessarily see March for Our Lives, and immediately run back and draw up stricter gun laws. The public doesn't respond well generally to these movements, even though in our history we were founded, the United States was founded on a rebellion, and we've had some very successful movements in our history. The Civil Rights Movement made enormous strides in our advances in our treatment of people with different color skin. If the military is the target, there is most likely not going to be very much public support at all, just because there's going to be so many people who are pro-military or who are directly affected or know somebody who's in the military. And so it's almost seen as a personal dig at them and their family members. Think about the Vietnam War. There was not much public support for the Vietnam War, but when people were protesting the Vietnam War, there was even less support for that. But if it is a widely spread or widely shared or legitimate goal, then there's likely going to be support. You can look back at those movements that I listed, and if you see that they do have a legitimate goal, let's take Civil Rights Movement, for example, legitimate goal in equal treatment, fair treatment for all people. And this is a widely shared belief, not just by, a few people in a certain part of the country, but, nationwide, most people wanted everyone to be treated equally. Then there will be a lot more public support. So that is the end of this very long lecture, and I can promise you, this is nearly 2 hours, I can promise you that the other lectures will be much shorter. This lecture covered 3 of our chapters of our book, and so what I want you to do is take a break, get a glass of water, and then we can sit down, go back through your notes, and you can sit down and listen to the other lectures. Thanks a lot for listening.